Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Hot Topics in Healthcare IT. My name is Virginia Mundos. I'm a Senior Program Manager within our Professional Services team here at Citrix. Before we get into the presentation, let me quickly review a few housekeeping details. We will have a live Q&A session towards the end of today's event, and you're welcome to submit your questions during the presentation. Simply type your question into the Ask a Question window and click Submit. Also, we are recording this event, and the on-demand version will be available from the same link that you used to join today. So feel free to come back, watch the archive, or share it with your colleagues. And finally, the slides are available for download from the Event Resource tab located along the top of the interface. I'm joined today by our in-house healthcare experts, Dan Morgan, Citrix Consulting Enterprise Architect, and Henry Viernov, Citrix Healthcare Service Provider Architect. Okay, let me go ahead and pass it over to Dan to kick things off for us. Dan?
Thank you, Virginia. So just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to start out with an introduction and overview of the session to frame what we're going to be discussing. And then we're going to dive into the three topics that we're meaning to discuss with you today: pod architecture, session recording, and thin clients. We'll be finishing up the session with Q&A, in which we'll be joined by Manu Chauhan, Director of Product Management. Just a quick overview, wanted to talk about some of the dynamics in the healthcare IT market that we're seeing being especially prevalent today. If you've seen Manu Chauhan and my healthcare session at Synergy over the last few years, this should look relatively familiar, and these topics should not be relatively new to you. We've seen most of these themes evolving over the years, some at different rates than others. So just to give you a quick overview of a few of them, healthcare, we've been seeing a tremendous amount of mergers and acquisition activity over the last several years, and that's a trend that we see no end in sight. So again, as organizations acquire other organizations and aggregate into larger conglomerates, additional demands are placed on IT to bring the new acquired organizations into the fold. We're seeing a much greater focus on cloud, particularly recently within the healthcare space. While healthcare may have lagged a little bit behind some other verticals in terms of investigating cloud, I would say the majority of the healthcare organizations we're talking about today are looking at it in some capacity, whether it be for DR or even running certain production workloads. So that's something that hopefully is on your horizons at this point. Again, mobility has been another big subject of discussion in the last couple of years, and I think that will only continue to pick up steam as well, particularly as digital natives are moving into the healthcare job market as nurses and physicians. Another thing to note is that generally in healthcare, that particularly depending on where the organization is, we've found customers struggle at times to fill the necessary ranks to maintain these increasingly large, complex IT systems at a high level. So that's a constraint that we tend to be working against pretty heavily in the healthcare industry. And then finally, security has been at the top of mind for every healthcare organization we've been talking to, particularly recently. HIPAA violations, for example, can be a costly expense for healthcare organizations if that's not mitigated against, with fines for a single record violation ranging from anywhere from $100 to $50,000, depending on the degree of negligence. So to that point, security has become an increasingly large focus for the healthcare industry.
Healthcare is one of the biggest and most important verticals for Citrix, and it's actually not by chance. There's a lot of value that our healthcare customers and EHR vendors get once they use Citrix solutions. As you see from these statistics, 85% of Epic Hyperspace on-prem deployments are running on top of XenApp. Speaking of Epic, XenApp and NetScaler are standards with ever-growing Epic hosting. Speaking of hosting, Cerner is delivering their EHR applications to hundreds of thousands of users, concurrent users, on a daily basis, and their entire hosting is running on top of XenApp. Also, speaking of EHR vendors, Allscripts is using Citrix products as their default within their hosting environment. All these numbers add up to having over 5 million caregivers using Citrix products to access healthcare information within their organizations. As to why are we here today? Well, as customers come to us for solutions, guidance, or best practices, there are certain themes that can be noticed when we talk to them. And what they ask for is for a system to be scalable, meaning that a platform should be able to scale to large numbers. As we now see deployments ranging from hundreds of users to tens of thousands of users. And as Dan mentioned earlier, with mergers and acquisitions happening in healthcare, we're expecting to see deployments going to hundreds of thousands of users and higher. And while we scale to these high numbers, the system should be stable, meaning that it should run consistently as the user load, network conditions, or environment changes occur. And if issues do happen, there must be workflows in place to address issues more efficiently. Also, while talking to healthcare organizations, what they're asking for is for improved integrations and improved workflows as it relates to endpoint devices. Again, there are many topics we can talk about, and we can spend days talking about it, but we only have a set amount of time. So Dan and I picked 3 most common questions that we get with a goal of sharing knowledge that we've gained internally so that you can listen back to your organization, and hopefully you'll be able to make your environment more optimal, more resilient, and user-friendly. What is a pod? Pod, although not a Citrix invention, was an industry approach to using a modular blocks to build a solution that is more resilient, scalable, and efficient. Pods are independent and self-contained XenApp and XenDesktop sites that are deployed within a single data center. Again, having to fail over to another pod is much easier and simpler than failing over to another data center. Pods, as we see, are great for preventing outages due to corruption issues, updates, database failures, or bugs. Right? Just to summarize, a XenApp and XenDesktop site is a single architectural and management entity that is used for delivery of applications and data, which are self-contained, a self-contained module. Pods within a data center or pods between data centers will depend largely on a scale or resiliency requirement that your organization is looking to achieve. There are certain things in life will happen, and in IT, failure will happen. It is our responsibility to design and deploy a system where component failure or even site failures will not diminish functionality of the solution. We're also asked to design a system where our users don't feel the effects or a failure of a system, and the system continues to run as expected. If it's going to fail, it is our recommendation to put it in a pod. And the experience has shown from the field that PVS and SQL are the top 2 sources of outages for XenApp and XenDesktop. And if components will fail, they deserve to be in a separate pod, right? So PVS Farm and SQL infrastructure are an example. That's in addition to SQL high availability that many organizations have, we still suggest separating SQL in a separate pod. We'll never say that pod architectures are free of complexity or cheap, but what pod provides to all organizations is the most reliability and highest uptime that health organizations and other organizations are looking for. Now, a couple points to mention. Resiliency in healthcare, that's no longer an option. It's not enough. This is more of a component level redundancy with a single point of failure. For example, we might have all redundant Citrix components, but we only have one storefront, meaning if a storefront fails and you have other redundant components, it makes us no good. The system is down. High availability, great. If a component fails, the system will continue to run, meaning if the same storefront will fail, users will not see any differences. But what if your data center is down? Well, that's where disaster recovery or a pod will help us, where it will provide a service continuity when issues happen. Failures will happen in primary data center or primary site, and we can easily and safely continue to run the system in other locations. And again, most of us are familiar with storefront. It's a Citrix component that provides a portal, the applications for users to consume, meaning this is the portal where they will log in to launch applications from their environment. And the Citrix storefront is able to communicate with all sites smartly, right, and properly enumerate the applications, meaning the users, instead of seeing two icons, it will be able to aggregate all the applications and present a single icon to the users. Also, storefront is smart enough to understand whether the site is up or down and where applications should be launched. So if my production site is down, storefront will launch the application in a correct site. What we see also with this, with high availability, is our healthcare customers are mostly using active or active passive deployments to better protect their system and provide highest uptime for their applications.
So you're probably wondering, why we're even talking about this in the first place in the context of healthcare. So again, as Henry was talking about earlier, this is the most important thing in your environment, which is protecting your EHR. At the end of the day, if you're using Citrix to provide access to your EHR solution, if Citrix is down, your EHR solution is down. So again, using pods is going to be one of the best ways that you can protect your uptime. From an operational perspective, this protects you against risks during updates or upgrades that you may be making, such that way you can execute change control on one pod while the other pod is taking the load, and then therefore you could bleed users back onto the pod that you had made the change to, validate things are still working correctly before similarly draining and applying changes to another pod. Additionally, again, as we've been talking about environments in the healthcare space tending to get larger and larger as more and more organizations aggregate. From a scale perspective, using pods is a great way to ensure that your Citrix environment is going to be able to handle the particularly high log-on rate that you'll see in the healthcare space with environments of this size. So again, the other key piece is the main discussion around pods is minimizing failure domains. So how many users do we want to potentially have impacted in the event of a failure of an HA component, albeit unlikely? And one thing to keep in mind is that we're not telling you you have to deploy pods. This is a risk versus cost decision that every healthcare organization is going to have different dynamics that are going to come into play there, depending on uptime requirements, disaster recovery requirements, and such. So again, we're not trying to tell you that you have to deploy in this mechanism, but more or less arming you with information that if you decide to go in this direction, that you'll be in better shape.
On this slide, you can see a high-level overview of how pod architecture deployments might look. Again, it's made up of isolated blocks that will allow application desktop delivery in case of a site outage. We want to here, again, to highlight that what we're trying to do is protect against the SQL failure and how important SQL is. Looking at this diagram on the left-hand side, you have an access layer pod, which is made up of storefront and NetScaler, an access tier which aggregates resources and presents them as a single logical entity to the users. Storefront is a component that is fully aware of sites and even zones if you decide to choose them. Our suggestion here would be whenever you're deploying storefronts, make sure you point them to a consistent set of delivery controllers within your environment. Otherwise, we have seen issues happening. Also, if you're planning to scale up storefront and access a storefront in particular, we suggest to scale it up and add additional CPU and RAM resources to the servers. Now, let's look at the middle pane, a site pod, which is made up of a controller and resource layer. It contains delivery controller, which is responsible for authentication, enumeration, and brokering, and SQL, right? Our goal here is to isolate this site and make it a self-contained unit to make sure that it functions on its own, meaning it gets its own SQL and VDAs. That in case, as was mentioned earlier, if there are any issues with the upgrades, updates, bugs, etc., the system will continue to run as it should. What we recommend is if it's a deployment of under 10,000 sessions, you should deploy it as a single site, single entity. If you're looking to deploy the system for 10,000 users and higher, we suggest you use zones or additional sites, right? This is more just to ensure that during the outage, LHC will work as expected and will be able to handle a VDA registration and also be able to broker users to the VDAs during the SQL outage. From the sizing perspective, we size about delivery controllers to handle 5,000 sessions. So make sure to deploy N+1 delivery within your environment. From the PVS perspective, it will depend, right? If you're looking for a complete isolation, PVS farm per site is the way to go. Otherwise, you can have a single farm with multiple sites in PVS, which will act as a streaming boundary within your environment and also protect against the DDoS corruption on a site level. On a SQL side, if you can use probably the SQL server from your site or a pod that we just discussed. And the reason for this is that PVS is more forgiving during SQL outages due to offline database functionality. And if possible, use a separate SQL server. You can probably share it with session recording, as we'll discuss later. Speaking from a director, we suggest taking director out of a pod, and for a simple reason. By taking director out of a pod, you're allowed to aggregate data and use the one director deployment to view, monitor, work with multiple sites. This way, when IT administrators will log into a director portal, they will be able to search user sessions, look for delivery groups, machine catalogs, etc., across different sites. And know that if you're running a report from a delivery from a Citrix director, that it will increase RAM utilization on your delivery controller when running a report. From a licensing perspective, pods can share licensing across different pods, different sites, unless it's a large healthcare environment or any environment with a high request rate. And high would mean 50 to 60 checkouts per second with over 70 concurrent sessions under concurrent user model, or over 150 concurrent sessions with user device model. Again, this was a joint effort. This was discovered under a joint effort between Citrix and another healthcare organization during a scalability exercise. And also, we have another component highlighted here, session recording. Here, we just wanted to highlight that a single session recording deployment, whether it's load balanced or not, can handle recordings from multiple XenApps and desktop pods or sites. So the suggestion here, if you're planning to support more than 4,000 sessions, you should look into scaling it out and adding additional session recording servers.
So one important thing to keep in mind, as Henry spoke to earlier, is that really the access tier is the glue that ties pods together. But one thing to keep in mind is that, while we've been talking some of this in the context of having multiple pods in the same data center, probably a more common example is when you have a separate pod in multiple data centers. And you need to have a mechanism, again, to ensure that users can seamlessly access resources from either side. Now, one important consideration when designing that is making sure that storefront is what we like to call meshed, or is able to speak to pods in either data center, such that in the event that you had a failure at for example, a NetScaler or a storefront level in one of the data centers, the storefront and NetScaler in the other data center would be able to pick up the slack, continue enumerating resources across both data centers, and allow users to continue to access them. So that's one important thing to keep in mind here from a traffic flow perspective.
Speaking of storefront and access layer, once again, whether it's a one-site, multi-site, multi-zone deployment, storefront is fully capable of aggregating and consolidating resources, assigning preferences to sites, and assigning user mappings for users as well. This is so that apps appear as one icon to the users, regardless of the site or design of the site that is currently available within the environment. However, for those things to work for site aggregation and subscription synchronization, a few things need to be configured within the environment. One, base URL needs to match between server groups. Also, delivery controller object name needs to match between server groups, and that can be found under Manage Delivery Controllers. Also, if in the environment is utilizing receiver for Windows with self-service with specific user profiles configured, you need to make sure that service record IDs are identical across the deployment. This is to ensure that if failover happens between the sites, a same user profile within the receiver is used during the failure, failover, etc. within the environment. Again, also for added security, we do suggest installing SSL certificates. Also, please ensure that when doing that, you include appropriate, fully qualified domain names. And again, if you decide to use wildcard certificates within your environment, just know that if private key gets compromised, those certificates get compromised as well. As we talk about image management, one of the concerns that is constantly voiced to us is, if I have multiple pods or sites deployed, do I need to manage multiple vDisks, multiple golden images? In fact, that's not the case. By using a combination of settings with a group policy to assign delivery controllers to VDA, and also certain settings on VDA itself, such as disabling auto update feature, administrators are able to use single vDisk across the board. One suggestion there also is to make sure that your Active Directory OU structure is properly configured and group policy works as expected. If your organization is using MCS, again, you can replicate a VM that is used as a golden image, master image, across different sites, different data centers, and again, use the same mechanism to update machine catalogs and deploy new VDAs. Speaking of the profiles, for the most part, EHR vendors do not save anything in the profile itself and use other mechanisms to save user-specific data. This means that the proper or most common recommendation is to use local or mandatory profiles within the environment for few reasons, being faster login and no management overhead. However, if certain environments do require roaming profiles to use, there are a couple of recommendations that I would have is to make sure to optimize them. Right? Whenever you use group policy for folder direction, ensure that you enable an option to exclude folders from roaming profiles so that user data doesn't get copied every time user logs in. Also, if we're using pod architecture, we're using pods within the same data center, that means that the same profile can be used across the board, across the pods. However, if we're talking about a multi-site data center deployment, the same profile cannot be used in an active manner, and this is because due to a distributed file locking limitation within the Microsoft operating system. So again, make sure to optimize the solution and use group policy to your advantage to exclude certain folders from roaming, and make sure that, again, profile size stays as little as possible to ensure faster login times. Speaking of a login rate, as was mentioned earlier in a webinar, make sure to size your delivery controllers properly to ensure that delivery controllers can handle login rate during the LHC mode when LHC is active, and also make sure to size delivery controller and use a single socket with multiple cores, because LHC feature can only take advantage of a single socket. Also, just to make you aware, when LHC kicks in, there's an election process that happens in alphabetical order. So again, if you know which delivery controller will take over, will be a master during the LHC mode activation, make sure that it's sized appropriately.
So one thing that you're probably wondering at this point as well is, with the advent of the localhost cache being reintroduced into the product, why isn't it possible to use a single site with multiple zones across data centers versus going with a pod type architecture where you would have a separate site in each data center? So first off, I'll acknowledge that it's absolutely true that our zones functionality within 7.15 and beyond has been significantly improved since the introduction of functionality in 7.7 in terms of the latency tolerance between the satellite zones and the SQL servers. And secondly, the LHC, which effectively replaced connection leasing functionality, does provide better behavior in the advent of a loss of SQL connectivity. So again, these are things that I fully acknowledge for you today, and that, as we've stated in the reference architecture for multiple EHR vendors, that again, while we would prefer a pod architecture with separate sites in each data center at a minimum, using a single site with multiple zones is an acceptable option. Again, what we're really talking about here is risk tolerance versus cost. Because again, if you have separate sites versus a single site with multiple zones, you're going to have to maintain multiple independent sets of configurations, which does add administrative overhead to the function or to the solution. And as we've described before, additional complexity is added to the solution at the access tier level as well as the control tier. So again, we're not trying to tell you to go one way or another, but we obviously strongly believe that the pod architecture is going to provide you the greatest degree of resilience. Now, to that operational point, which is probably the biggest sticking point for customers that I talk to who are resistant to potentially deploying a pod architecture, is again around replicating sessions from different pods to the others. Now, fortunately, there have been some great community efforts over the last year or two that have resulted in some automation utilities that will include within the notes of this deck that you can use out there to help automate replicating settings from one pod to other pods to help mitigate that operational overhead that you have there. And again, I like to frame it in the sense that it actually provides significant operational benefits in the sense that you can apply changes to discrete units that limits the risk with each of those associated changes. Finally, to wrap up the pod architecture field tips, just want to talk a little bit more about SQL because that is the most important component that we're protecting against here. So just because you're deploying in a pod architecture, you're probably still going to want to deploy highly available SQL infrastructure. So that is something that goes into the cost calculation with respect to this. Depending on which SQL high availability mechanism you're using, whether it be always on availability groups or just standard always on failover clusters, those mechanisms both require SQL Enterprise licenses, which we acknowledge are not cheap. Although one thing to note is that you can use basic availability groups, which allow you to use SQL standard licenses. Essentially that was a feature that was added by Microsoft to take the place of the legacy mirroring technology, but that's something definitely to look at to reduce the cost associated with having a separate SQL infrastructure for each pod versus having one for a single site that you would split into multiple zones.
All right, so let's move on to the next section, next topic that we're planning to cover in this webinar, session recording in healthcare and how it's being used. We all know that EHR systems are not simple and clinicians are time sensitive, while IT staff at times is overburdened. So when issues happen, it becomes a challenge to get a doctor's time to reproduce an issue or try to reproduce a very specific and rare issue. And such delays can affect the user experience and system stability. Well, we've spoken to a number of healthcare organizations, and we have seen that healthcare organizations are starting to deploy session recording within their environments, whether it's small environment or large environment. They started to implement this solution for troubleshooting purposes, meaning that when issues do happen within the environment while running EHR applications or other applications, IT staff has enough information to start troubleshooting the issue without spending time on reproduction or spending time over and over again internally trying to explain to other teams or groups what was the issue, right? And although also unfortunate, but security incidences do happen, and employees do access information for inappropriate causes. And in some cases, they might decide to plug in a USB stick into their endpoint device and possibly copy data. So with recent release of session recording, we can configure the product to bookmark certain events within the recording, such as a USB stick, and make it easier for administrators to find certain events without looking through an 8-hour recording session. Session recording can get integrated into Citrix Director, meaning that you can trigger a recording of a session right from a director. This is once again will help IT admins and help desk teams to start recording a session when they're working with a user to help them with certain situations. There are certain drivers that are causing healthcare organizations to implement session recording within their environment. And few objectives were they wanted to help IT address issues quicker, which eventually will save them money, time, and possibly some aggravation, right? And it will also, at the end of the day, will improve end user experience when using the system or when troubleshooting the issue that they have seen. In case issues do happen, session recording issues will not cause pod or a site outage within your environment. And in case session recording server is down, the recording will actually be kept on the VDA while space is available. And once session recording server comes back online, the videos and metadata will be synced back to database and shared storage. Also, just to make a note that IOPS and size of these recordings, the size of the session recording session will be dependent on the session workload, the application you're running, and a graphics mode that is configured within your environment. Just a suggestion is I would suggest to monitor MSMQ buffer on the VDA and session recording server that they ensure that there's no bottlenecks and no data loss will happen while recording the session.
So for those of you less familiar with session recording, there are a few major components that you need to be aware of. There's the session recording agent, which is what sits on the VDAs and actually transmits the ICA information back to what's called the session recording server, again, which receives the session recording information coming from the VDAs. And then when an administrator wants to view recordings that had previously been captured, they would do that through the session recording player. As you can see here, this is a diagram of a load balanced architecture of the session recording server. This was first introduced as an experimental feature in 7.14. It was not included within the LTSR release of 7.15, but was brought back in CR releases following 7.15. But this is important to note because in the load balanced architecture, NetScaler can be used to load balance session recording servers, which are being spoken to by the session recording agents. As we'll talk about in a minute, this can greatly increase the scalability of the solution depending on the sheer volume of the sessions that you're attempting to record. In the case of a load balance architecture, you would be storing the session recordings themselves in shared storage. So essentially a UNC path that that all of the session recording servers in that particular group can all talk to, and then session recording has a SQL database that essentially keeps track of the metadata about the particular recordings. So again, this entire product is based on MSMQ, so that's something you're going to want to keep in mind because that ties into most of the key tips that we have for you in the next couple of slides.
So as Dem mentioned in the previous slide, since the load balancing session recording option was not available in 7.15 LTSR release, there are certain things we can share with you that a company or organization that is following LTSR path can mix and match versions, meaning that if you can use LTSR version of session recording agent installed on your VDA, and at the same time you can use session recording CR installation for your server. This way you can take advantage of the load balancing feature within session recording and at the same time be supported under LTSR path for 5 years of support plus 5 years of extension. Meaning now you can use mix LTSR and CR versions within your architecture. Since some of the organizations have already deployed session recording within their environment using LTSR installation bits, and now look at the balancing feature, there are a couple of steps that they can take to migrate to this architecture. One, they will need to copy the data from a local storage to a shared storage, right, that both servers will be able to access. And then Citrix also provides a utility that will allow that will update the metadata of the SQL database to reflect the newly adjusted path of the data, right? So where previously it was your local location, C:/ whatever it is, now it can be will reflect a UNC path of your recording files. In terms of sizing and optimizations, you want to make sure, again, to mention, you want to monitor MSMQ cache size on your VDA server and your session recording servers to ensure that you're not overburdening them with data. Also, if you have deployments under 4,000 users, you can use a single session recording server, or again, you can use load balancing architecture session recording servers for 4,000 users. However, if you're planning to scale higher, you need to ensure that to include multiple session recording servers to handle the data load. And storage will be your biggest bottleneck. You need a lot of it. Make sure to monitor disk reads, writes, IOPS, and disk queues to make sure the data is being written efficiently and no data is being discarded on a session recording server. Again, as was mentioned earlier, your environment will continue to run if session recording deployment or server will go down. Again, if you're using session recording within the pod architecture, you can use a single session deployment for multiple sites, multiple pods. As long as the only thing that will need to change is but again, the name of your session recording server or full qualified domain name of the session recording will need to be adjusted on the VDA.
So one thing to keep in mind in the healthcare space, in particular with session recording, is that inherently when recording EMR sessions, you're going to have PHI that is contained within these recordings. So you're going to want to make sure that the same rigor that you would apply for access controls to systems that contain PHI, such as your EMR system itself, you want to make sure you have those same controls in place within the session recording environment. Again, just to make sure that you're sufficiently covered from a security perspective on this. Now, to highlight a few key things that we want to make sure that you are monitoring through your standard enterprise monitoring tools. Again, we've talked about the number of 4,000 in terms of approximate number at which point you may want to consider second or additional session recording servers. That's kind of a rough estimate because, again, to be honest, it's completely dependent upon the actual sessions that you're recording. The larger the ICA session is that you're recording from a bandwidth perspective and a throughput perspective, the more data that's going to be captured as part of session recording. And again, the limits here are really going to be storage and how fast MSMQ is able to process the data. So the majority of the things that we're going to look at are really related to that. So again, monitoring the MSMQ cache on both the VDA and the session recording server is going to be critically important because, again, the moment that you hit the maximum size of the cache, beyond that point, data will start being lost, which obviously is not ideal. So again, that cache being worked down is strictly a function of how quickly the MSMQ storage manager can process the information and get it to your ultimate storage location. So again, if you see your MSMQ cache filling up, that could be an indication that, one, you may need to increase the size of your MSMQ cache to handle, potentially some sort of burst of activity within the environment, or an indication that you may need additional session recording servers to handle the load of your environment. Obviously, all these operations are going to be I/O intensive, so you're going to want to make sure that you keep an eye on that, again, across all components, just to make sure that your storage infrastructure is sufficiently handling the amount of writes that you're sending at it. Because like I said, it's going to be quite a bit, particularly depending on how large your ICA sections are. One thing to note, too, is that the message bytes per second counter is something that you can look at on your session recording server. That is going to tell you essentially the rate at which the MSMQ storage manager is actually processing the MSMQ messages and writing it to backend storage. So when you see that metric plateau at a certain point as you're loading up the environment, that could be an indication of your maximum MSMQ storage management processing, which again is going to be an important thing to know as you're deploying this and sizing your environment. And then finally, you can actually, we have a proprietary metric that you can look at on the VDAs. It's actually determining the total amount of bytes that our driver is sending to MSMQ, which, given that most EMR solutions are being deployed on DNAP today, you're going to have multiple sessions in a particular VDA, and that's going to give you an idea of the total throughput that's getting generated by that particular VDA, which again will be important for sizing as you're looking at your environment and you're looking at historical trends to make sure you're going to be able to meet future capacity demands. All right, let's talk a bit about thin clients. So many healthcare organizations have already achieved a state in which they're deploying thin clients out in the clinical space and also in certain back office functions. But there are many other healthcare organizations that are at different stages of that particular journey. I think we can all agree upon the fact that thin clients is really kind of the nirvana state that you want to get to, because at the end of the day, they're going to be far cheaper than putting out a thick, high-powered Windows device, particularly in the clinical space. From a troubleshooting and operations perspective, thin clients tend to require a lot less touch from administrators, which can be particularly important for sprawling healthcare systems with lots of different facilities and, even physician practices, which could be all over the place and likely don't have local dedicated IT staff. And again, one challenge that we see a lot is standardization following M&A activity. If, as a healthcare organization, you have a thin client strategy, it's very easy to enforce that standardization because either A, as devices in an organization that you acquired go end of life, you can deploy out your thin client there to access your virtual resources, or again, that's something if you want to enforce consistency, that's something that's going to be a bit easier to deploy. And again, the idea of having a device that you could essentially, if you're running into issues with it, you could throw out and replace from a new one that's sitting in a closet and have to have minimal touch to get users up and working again on the workstation, again, is kind of the dream state. And now, in healthcare organizations, you're in a unique position in the sense that your most critical app is usually already virtualized on XenApp. So you would look at that and say, okay, well, the amount of work that I have to do to fully virtualize a use case may be less than another organization, outside of healthcare that is using XenApp more sporadically for certain line of business applications, as an example. So there are many healthcare-specific thin client challenges that I just want to highlight here really quickly. I'm not going to go through each of these in too much detail because most of these at this point are solved problems, and many of them vary depending on your EMR vendor, and depending on your EMR solution, you can work with your EMR vendor on these, or if you need additional assistance from Citrix Consulting, we're well-versed in these decisions. But again, in healthcare, we often see a mix of workflows that can also depend on location. So, for example, the workflow that a doctor may do in an office would be completely different potentially than the types of things that he would do on a clinical device, and there may be different requirements there. Another constraint that we see a lot is that clinicians tend to be a bit more resistant to user experience changes than other user populations. Again, their objective is to have as much patient engagement as they possibly can. So they want to spend the least time as possible thinking about how to do something on their computer to help accomplish that. So that is one thing that we see sometimes that can be a challenge within adoption of thin clients and virtual resources because it may result in a workflow change. If you've gone through some of these exercises before, you've also had the thought, do you want to roam your session or do you not want to roam your session? Again, there are some specifics that you would need to be aware of depending on your specific EMR vendor, but this is a really big question, and again, it ties back into that mix of workflows, because while it may be beneficial to roam your session if you're working for, if a physician is in his personal office and then wants to go home and pick up his activities, but then on the other hand may not want to roam that same session into the clinical space when that EMR session may be launched in an entirely different context and being used for different purposes. And printing is another challenge we see a lot because thinking about it in the context of quote-unquote local printing, so that's traditional printing with network printers or locally attached printers, and then background printing because as all of you who've deployed EMR systems know, many of the EMR vendors have background printing jobs that effectively use vendor proprietary print solutions to generate print jobs and get them out to printers. And those solutions are highly dependent on knowing what workstation that the user is coming in from. Another thing we see a lot more in healthcare that we don't necessarily see as much in other industries is questions around user context of sessions. again, depending on where the user is at a point in time. In healthcare, we see a lot more anonymous user sessions or user sessions that are auto-launched using a service account versus actually being in the context of the actual physician or nurse who's accessing the resources. And a final question that comes up a lot when determining how you're going to orient your thin client strategy and what resources you need to provide is, do you even require a desktop experience? One common thing that we see in the clinical space is, workstations that their only purpose is to sit there and auto-launch a session to the EMR application that essentially will remain open and, again, will only get re-auto-launched if it's closed for whatever reason. And for sessions like that, the question is, do I even need to provide a desktop experience for that user since they're effectively using this workstation like a kiosk where they really just need to see the EMR application? And then if a desktop experience is required, the question is, do I provide my EMR via XenApp and a double hop to my desktop experience, or do I put my EMR app directly within the desktop? Again, there are lots of pros and cons and ways to address each of these items. They're relatively known quantities at this point, and these are something that your EMR vendors and Citrix can absolutely help you out with. But I want to offer you some tips that we've gotten through executing these desktop transformation type projects across a number of healthcare organizations. So the thing that I see in organizations that were successful versus organizations who have not yet been successful with thin client deployments is largely on the knowledge of user workflow requirements and what applications that they're actually using as part of their daily jobs. Again, not having that set of information fleshed out before determining to deploy to a set of users or to a particular area, I have seen to be the most common cause of failure. So my key piece of advice that you need to keep in mind there is that you're going to want to make sure that you gather all that information in excruciating detail in advance to make sure that what you're providing day one is going to meet the requirements of your end users. The second piece is around printing, because again, one thing that often gets forgot is the quote-unquote local printing with network printers. Oftentimes, healthcare organizations will define those on the actual Windows endpoint, right, which are then brought into the Citrix session. If you're going to a true thin device, you may not have the luxury of that. So you need to come up with some other solution to handle that. There are lots of ways to do that, including group policy preference, but one thing that you may find is that from an administrative perspective, that can be challenging, and oftentimes healthcare organizations in that case will use some sort of follow me printing solution, which is available from, again, a number of different vendors. But sometimes that is a hidden cost that isn't necessarily factored in initially. Also, picking the right thin client is really important. Do you need just a low-power, very locked-down Windows device, or do you want to go all the way and use something like a YSDNOS device or a Linux device? And, with healthcare, depending on where the workstation is, it may also have different peripheral requirements. You need to make sure that whatever thin client you're getting has the correct ports. So you may not even be able to pick a standard thin client across all areas, but just make sure that you're factoring that into your strategy as you're going along. And then finally, just make sure that you're starting small. Do your user analysis and device analysis thoroughly, and then pick a use case that represents low-hanging fruit. That's generally the best way to have a springboard for success, to start looking at some of the more challenging use cases. So again, just keep these in mind as you're moving forward with your thin client strategy.
Another option that we're that some of the healthcare organizations have been looking for, again, is to add some of the workflows that will make their clinicians, doctor more efficient. So they started to investigate and look into using a Workspace Hub. A Workspace Hub is a low-cost thin client, which is based on a Raspberry Pi platform and is manufactured by M Computing and ViewSonic, with few very unique workflow improvement features. One is called screencasting. This is where a user can redirect their display can redirect a session from their mobile device or tablet to one of these Workspace Hub, right? And at that point, while the session displayed on a Workspace Hub, a mobile device or tablet can be used for input, for keyboard and mouse input, right? And this leverages beacon detection and QR code scanning for connection. And this can be used well when a clinician can walk into a patient room and wants to share some information, whether it's a patient record or something else, with a patient, without having the need to lose a session. So the doctor can move a session to one of these Workspace Hub monitors. Also, another option which can be used within the healthcare environment is session roaming. This is where a Citrix session roams from a tablet or a mobile device to a Workspace Hub completely, meaning at that time a session is running with the Workspace Hub and the keyboard and mouse is also used from the Workspace Hub. This can be triggered through a QR code scan. And again, just to mention a couple of use cases that we have seen most of the interest is when a doctor is using a mobile device or a tablet as they roam to the hospital and they get back to their office or to where they want to bring back the session to their local computer. Again, they can bring their mobile device and tablet close to the Workspace Hub, which will roam the session without them having the need to relog in. So again, less clicks, quicker, same user experience across the board, which makes life easier.
All right, let's quickly recap on some of the key points that we talked about today. So first, we talked a bit about pod architecture, which, as we stated before, deploying in a pod architecture is going to be the best bet if resiliency is your absolute most important factor. Because as we've discussed, this is a great way to cut down risk and failure domains within your environment, again, knowing that there is an associated cost from both a SQL and a management overhead perspective. And again, make sure you're using that you're leveraging automation to reduce the operational overhead associated with managing multiple pods, again, if that's within the skill set of the team that you're running. Now, session recording, we have two possible architectures that we discussed, a standalone architecture and a load balanced architecture. Again, the load balanced architecture is going to be necessary if you're going to go for a highly manageable solution at a larger scale. And of course, if you want to have greater resiliency in the event of a session recording server failing. Now, keep in mind that if you want to do the LTSR VDA, and still want to use the load balanced architecture, you can use the LTSR SR agent with a load balanced deployment of CR session recording servers. So in that case, that would be 718, which just came out a few days ago. So finally, thin clients, if you're going to move in this direction, which I think we can all agree is one of the best case scenarios that you can have from a cost and a management perspective, make sure you really do your homework on your user analysis first. Make sure you factored in your printing requirements and how that management experience is going to be like. And then finally, when you're in the process of selecting your thin clients, keep your eye out for Workspace Hub, which is a low-cost thin client device that has some great features that may be able to enhance some of your workflows as you're designing the workspace of the future. Before we move into Q&A, If there's anything that we've talked about today or anything else that you believe that you need some extra horsepower or knowledge on, feel free to reach out to your Citrix representative who can put you in touch with folks on our consulting services side. Again, we've helped out a number of healthcare organizations around the country to be successful doing things, ranging from health checks all the way up to, full-scale migrations of XenUp 6.5 onto a robust, scalable, highly available 7X platform.
Great session, guys. Before we move into Q&A, I'd like to remind our audience that if you have a question for our speakers, you can submit it in the Ask a Question area on your screen. Simply type your question in the text box and hit Submit. I know we're almost at the top of the hour, but we will stay on and answer as many questions as we can. If we don't have time to answer all our questions here today live, keep an eye out on the Citrix blog for a complete rundown of the FAQs. Today we have Sarah Steinhoff, a senior architect on our consulting team, with us to moderate our Q&A. So I'll hand it over to Sarah now. Take it away, Sarah.
Great. Thanks, Virginia. The first question we have coming in, I'm going to toss this over to Henry, was about clarifying those licensing scalability numbers. They sounded a little bit low on the webinar. Can you give us some more information there?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. So just to clarify, each login and log off within the environment, including disconnects and reconnects, considered are licensing requests. So to clarify, from scalability perspective, licensing server can handle 50 to 60 requests per second with 70,000 concurrent sessions under CCU licensing model and 150,000 sessions under user device licensing model. So again, to just make sure whenever sizing your environments, whether they're in a pod or single-site deployment, make sure the licensing server can handle your user load.
Great, thanks, Henry. Next one is, we've been hearing a lot about Citrix Cloud. I think that was a main feature at Synergy and a lot of our recent marketing materials. Manu, can you talk to us a little about what Citrix's position is regarding Citrix Cloud for our healthcare EMR customers?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. So just to level set everyone, if you're kind of new to cloud, Citrix Cloud essentially takes the management components that you'd normally operate on your premises and puts them into a Citrix-operated cloud environment. And when I say management components, I'm talking about, or management plane, I'm talking about Director, Studio, SQL Server, Storefront, et cetera. So the benefit of that is, as a customer, you no longer have to deal with the deployment and upgrades that you normally or traditionally do. Citrix will keep that management plane evergreen for you. And so you can keep the workloads, that is the VDA and the apps, on-prem in your data center, or you can put them into the public cloud. So with that said, with regard to the EHRs working on Citrix Cloud, we are in active discussions with the EHR providers. You can start to expect to see them highlight their positions with regard to Citrix Cloud. I'd mentioned that several of our largest healthcare customers are using Citrix Cloud in production today, and they're starting to look at their non-EHR workloads. They started with their non-EHR workloads, and they're starting to look at their EHR workloads over time, or they're starting to look at them over time. But I definitely recommend that you notify your EHR rep of what you're trying to do with Citrix Cloud. We work very closely with all of them, and it allows us to stay better aligned to help our customers.
Great, thanks, Manu. This next one, I think I'm going to loop two questions together. So with 7.x now supporting multiple zones, getting a couple of questions around what's the balance between multiple zones versus multiple sites and the designs that we're seeing at customers. And then we had a specific question about how that applies to our storefront servers. So again, if you have multiple data centers, regardless of what you're doing with your XenApp sites, how are you handling your storefront with your server group splitting between those multiple locations? Dan, you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So with respect to a single site with multiple zones or splitting into multiple sites, we actually have customers who are doing everything that you can imagine within the spectrum of that, ranging from a healthcare company out west who has 6 VDI pods and 4 XenApp pods, ranging down to some of our smaller customers who only have a single data center and are obviously doing a single site. And then again, everything in between, for example, a customer with 2 data centers practically LAN connected, moving forward with a large EMR deployment with a single site with 2 zones. So really we're seeing a mix, and the variables that tend to dictate whether a customer ends up selecting going with a pod architecture versus not depend on a few things. Size is a big factor, so we tend to see some of our larger healthcare customers usually choose to go down the pod route, and then usually a linked factor to that is the IT staffing. So obviously, as we've described, there are some additional maintenance activities associated with maintaining multiple pods. So generally, larger IT staffs or IT staffs with in-house automation skill sets tend to look more down the pod direction. So again, we see a good mix, and we obviously prefer that you go with the pod-based approach, since that's going to afford you the maximum resiliency and operational flexibility when you're introducing change into the environment. But again, going with a single site with multiple zones is a completely valid approach that we've seen, again, a lot more with the advent of 715 LTSR. So to answer the storefront question, whether you want to have a single storefront server group or multiple server groups, that often depends on what your data center architecture looks like. So for example, if you had 2 data centers that are effectively LAN connected from a bandwidth and latency perspective, we've seen some customers elect to go with a single server group, because that way they can manage that as one entity with the configurations replicated across them. On the other hand, if the data centers have some latency in between them, because of the way that the mesh architecture is handling the credential wallet and subscription database, you're definitely going to want to split those into separate server groups. Regardless of what your data center situation is, if you have multiple data centers, I would still recommend doing 2 server groups, because that's going to make your maintenance a lot easier. So if you want to take down a particular server group to make changes to it, such as applying an update, you could be directing all of your traffic to the other storefront server group while you make that change in perfect isolation, which gives you, the opportunity to reduce your risk.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Kind of along those same lines, if we do go down the route of multiple sites or pods like we talked about, what's the recommended order of installing updates without introducing an outage, or at least minimizing our service interruption? Henry, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. So as was mentioned a couple of times during this webinar, EHR is one of the main applications in the environment, and uptime is very critical. So introducing of the pod deployment enables us to keep that statistics uptime pretty high. So first thing we need to do is to drain the pod so that we have no users logged into that environment. And to do that, we can take couple of ways we can accomplish this. One, we can take VDs, put VDs in the maintenance mode. That will stop new sessions being established, but also at the same time, it will allow existing sessions to reconnect. If you're using NetScaler to load balance XML brokers, you can just also disable that XML diff that will stop connections being established to your pod. So again, once there are no sessions established in the environment, you can start installing the update. And again, that will provide additional flexibility into the environment, a couple of ways. That if something goes wrong during the upgrade, users are continuing to log into other pods and they don't see any issues with the environment, and you can work within a pod that's in maintenance, whether you want to address an issue or do whatever else needs to be done. So again, disabling XML VIP on a NetScaler, putting VDAs in the maintenance mode, or you can even take the XML VIP or IP address of the XML brokers from your storefront configurations will enable you to drain the sessions and take the pod into maintenance mode.
Okay, thanks, Henry. This is going to be our last question here. We have a question specifically about thin clients. Do we have any recommendations or best practices around whether they should be domain joined or standalone? Dan, you want to talk about what we see most often in our customers?
Yeah, for sure. So that really depends on the type of thin client that's selected. So the only thin clients that we ever really see being domain joined are obviously when you pick some sort of thin Windows client, right? So for the Linux-based or the trimmed down Linux builds such as WiseThinOS, those we very rarely, if ever, see domain joined. And on the Windows side, I personally think it's beneficial for those to be domain joined so you can more easily manage them through your traditional software deployment tools.
Great. All right, I think that wraps it up for the questions we had in the queue. Thanks everyone for hanging in there with us. I know we went a little bit over the hour. As a reminder, this recording will be available once this is all done and posted in the same link that you used to register. And we look forward to catching you on the next TIPS webinar.